Democracy That Delivers is brought to you by the Center for International Private Enterprise. Now, to your host.
Hi there. My name is Stacey Samuels, Program Officer for the Anti-Corruption and Governance Center, and this is a Democracy That Delivers podcast brought to you by the Anti-Corruption and Governance Center. Thank you for joining us. In the late summer of 2019, a new hopeful period for Sudan materialized. After more than 30 years in power, the government led by Omar al-Bashir was toppled by street protests led by citizens across the country. The grassroots movement that included citizens from all aspects of society and across different tribes proved to be resilient in the face of brutal government oppression. As with many revolutions, the spark that ignited the protests focused on economic injustice, pervasive corruption, and brutal government oppression. The protesters, led by women, youth, and numerous civil society groups, resisted state-sanctioned violence by security forces. Empowered by the successful revolutionary acts of common citizens demanding democracy and the end of the autocratic regime that presided over the country the last few decades, Sudan embarked on a 3-year democratic transition overseen by a joint military-civilian sovereign council. The main task was straightforward, but not simple. Reform the country from top down and rid the country of the systemic corruption that ruled the status quo. Tackling corruption garners wide support from the masses and the political reformists, but the implementation of anti-corruption reforms require their own level of transparency, integrity, and compliance. What looked to be progress on combating corruption issues entrenched in Sudanese government and economy alike created unintended and at times harmful consequences to the overall stability of Sudan's transition period. Here at SIPE, as Program Officer for the Anti-Corruption and Governance Center, I coordinate the Sudan portfolio alongside my colleagues in the Africa Department. SIPE has a growing presence in Khartoum and was one of the first NGOs on the ground supporting the reformists after the revolution, and interest in gaining insight to the changing landscape in Sudan. Therefore, I'd like to welcome my co-host and guest in this podcast. Joining me today as co-host is the director of the Anti-Corruption and Governance Center, Frank Brown, and Sudanese expert, Magdi Amin, who will take us through some of the anti-corruption measures that led to consequential effects on Sudan's democratic transition. Magdi Amin is the founder and managing partner of African Renaissance Partners, an investment and advisory firm set to launch in November 2022. With 2 decades of experience in multilateral institutions, private sector, and philanthropy, Magdi joined the transitional government of Sudan in January 2020 as a senior advisor to the Minister of Finance. He was a core part of the team working on economic reforms to stabilize the economy, regain access to international finance, and restructure Sudan's external debt and create broad-based growth. Welcome, Magdi.
Thank you, Stacey, and thank you, Frank. Really looking forward to this conversation and hopefully shed a little bit of light on very complex transition with, as you said, the goal of really meeting the needs and aspirations of millions of people who desired a better life for themselves in Sudan.
Great, thank you. Magdi, I would like to start off for our listeners on this episode who don't follow Sudan as carefully as we do. I was wondering if you could explain the significance of the fall of the Bashir regime, how that came about, and your role in it or your role supporting that transitionary period.
Sure, thank you. I'm not going to sort of focus on my role in overthrowing the regime, and that was really led by the resistance committees and civil society and many activists on the ground for many years. But so the Bashir regime ruled since 1989. And many people like myself, families had been outside of Sudan because of the difficulty, the both political and economic challenges of being there. Really were looking forward to the opportunity to help. The Bashir regime really, over time, became much more of a system of political patronage, and corruption was a big part of that. The use of public office for personal gain, and I would expand that to say the use of public office for the survival of the regime as opposed to the viability of the state and the economic welfare of its citizens. Over time, it became very clear to the population that their lives were, especially youth, really didn't have much of a future. The private sector was very narrowly based, particularly those who could, who were part of the network. It was very difficult for somebody in the private sector who wanted to remain independent to grow a viable business in the face of competition or attempts to extort or to incorporate any of those businesses as part of these patronage networks. A lot of the deals that did happen during that time were deals in which they were done because of the flow of resources and the skimming of the share of the investment that could have been taken, as opposed to actually building proper businesses or infrastructure. And so when we came in, and here the Minister of Finance, Ibrahim al-Badawi, was the one who asked me to join. I had visited Sudan and been and visited the sit-ins and continued an interest. And I'd worked on Sudan as part of the World Bank group after the Comprehensive Peace Agreement. So I was interested in helping, and the minister, who I knew from the World Bank, asked me to join. And there's a huge agenda. Anti-corruption, I would say, has to be looked at more broadly. It's not only that we wanted to specifically address in a legal sense those past crimes, because that really wasn't what I focused on. But that is an important part of what happened in the agreement after the revolution. What I focused on are economic reforms like fuel subsidy reform or currency reform or customs exchange rate reform that all addressed some of the corrupt schemes that were happening before. There were a lot of smuggling, for example, that happened as a result of the fuel subsidies. But it was not only an anti-corruption effort, it was an economic reform effort. I can expand on that, and maybe if you can ask the specific questions that you would like me to address, I can expand on any of those points.
Great. Thank you. And I appreciate you giving the context to the audience about how even just looking at anti-corruption issues, it does exist in a broader context, including especially economic reform, like you were working on when you were advising the transition. So I think what also we're trying to get a sense of is, what were you seeing and hearing from the public in terms of the support for the type of work that you're doing in regard to advising, the Minister of Finance and essentially implementing these reforms that would attempt to address anti-corruption elements within, the reform that you were working on?
Well, what we heard from the public very loud and clear in the revolution, in the initial overthrow of Omar al-Bashir happened in April of 2019. There was a long period, including ongoing protests and clashes, the massacre in June. And then finally, the government was named in August. And that government that was formed in August was really a power-sharing agreement between the pro-democracy actors and military actors who were running the country after transitional military council that was running the country after the fall of Bashir. There are a number of institutions that were called for in the constitutional document, including an effort to dismantle the economic and political structures that supported the Bashir regime. This dismantling committee was called for, and a law was passed subsequently, I think it was in November, that empowered that committee. What we heard from the public was, Sudan had gone through an oil boom. Sudan had very rich natural resources, as gold, lots of agriculture, a strategic location, and yet the country was deeply impoverished, especially outside of Khartoum. The infrastructure was dilapidated. Many parts of the country still don't have electricity. The school system and the education, the health system had been privatized kind of corruptly under the Bashir regime. So this public service delivery was very much dilapidated and not reaching the citizens. All the while public services were collapsing, the regime became wealthy. The regime officials themselves became very wealthy. And certain institutions, for example, the security services, even today you see them still building, very large sports complex, a very large campus, within Khartoum that cost millions of dollars. and multiple armies, at least 3 armies, large military entities were built during that regime, let alone the militias, but in terms of where the state's resources were going. And so you had high unemployment, poor public services, and a very narrow clique within the regime getting very wealthy. And so one of the things called for after the revolution in terms of the dismantling committee was also to take on and to bring back to the public some of those funds that should have been going to building the state and the viability of the economy. And that started the work. And that group, that committee was formed under that law and started gathering evidence and then finally recapturing from the process of investigation a lot of those resources in order to transfer them to the Ministry of Finance on behalf of the people. Now, there are some issues with the transition and the formation of a joint council as opposed to what would hopefully be expected and was actually called for, is eventually a parliament, because the parliament could stand for and expand and ensure all of the interests of the people were being met, including with this respect to this dismantling committee. That parliament didn't exist, and so there are certain things that should have happened with the dismantling committee, such as an appeals process, judicial legal formulation of its structure in certain ways that were prevented because they should have been passed by that joint council. Now, that joint council between the sort of the transitional military and the forces of freedom and change on behalf of the pro-democracy forces was stalemated in some of those, such as the appeals committee, never got approved, which became a problem later because once the coup happened, the coup leaders cracked down pretty heavily on all of the actions and the committee members themselves and reversed many of the decisions and actions that it had taken. I don't fault the committee or I don't fault the law itself, but really more the fact that there wasn't a parliament that could have made sure that some of these institutions were put in place. And that's when it comes back to the sustainability. Because again, as people are seeing some of these actions reversed, there's a lot of anger. There's a lot of anger among the youth, among ordinary citizens, because they know what happened over 30 years. And they know that there will be no future for Sudan if such actions are allowed to continue. And if the resources, the people are going hungry and people don't face a viable future or good health care, they have to pay for so many things, even that are supposed to be provided by the state. They can't do that if there's going to be siphoning of those resources through corruption. So that's, I think, one of the key lessons that we learned is the need to anchor these processes and institutions in public legitimacy through a parliament, but also through, a strong legal backbone, including appeals committee. Because in the end, we're trying to get a viable and strong state, and it has to be through the rule of law that those institutions are strengthened.
Yeah, and thank you, Magdi. And I'd like to maybe back up a little bit. And, I'm listening to you talk about how the dismantling committees essentially became the face of part of this reform movement and kind of addressing past injustices. And so I want to hear from you in terms of what were the programs and initiatives on the table to address the corruption, to address the systemic corruption, whether it was in the work that you were doing and also the work that the Dismantling Commission were doing.
Okay. Now, I wasn't super close to the Dismantling Committee, so I can't really speak to all of what they were doing, but certainly what we were doing in terms of economic reform. So we were faced with a very, very deep economic hole. There's a massive trade deficit, but also a huge budget deficit that was something like 10% of GDP. A large part of that budget deficit was subsidies, particularly fuel subsidies. Fuel was among the cheapest in the world. I think there were maybe one country in the world that, when we kind of looked at a chart of this, that had cheaper gasoline or diesel. And the fuel subsidy was more than all of the revenue and grants that the government took in. So if we had that fuel subsidy were to continue, anything else we did in the government, whether it was security or the health or education or just basic administration, would need to be either borrowed or money printed, monetized by just expanding the money supply in order to pay for these things. Now, Sudan didn't have borrowing capacity. It was under sanctions. It was still on the U.S. state sponsors of terrorism list. So what Sudan was doing was monetizing this deficit, and that was fueling inflation and still is fueling inflation, much less now. So we really had to reform those subsidies. Now, why is this also corruption? And we also had to liberalize the exchange rate because there was a parallel market. When we were having this discussion initially, the official exchange rate was 55. The parallel market was around 100. But we faced a lot of opposition. So ultimately, the parallel market grew to 375. When you have that basically close to free diesel and gasoline, what happens is that there are folks within who have access to those imports who then sell it, particularly to neighboring countries, but also to the black market within Sudan. Because there are shortages. You don't have enough fuel, and then somebody can capture a big share of it and then sell it, let's say, far away from Khartoum where those supplies aren't going at a much higher price, but also to Eritrea or to Ethiopia or to Chad or other places that have already moved with subsidy reform. Even Egypt had. So those people who are taking advantage of that opportunity to sell the subsidized fuel, many of them were linked to the old regime. And so part of the anti-corruption effort was to reform. As I was saying before, the reason we did it is because the budget couldn't have been viable and we couldn't have invested in healthcare or education or infrastructure or good governance unless we addressed the fuel subsidy issue. Now, the black market in currency was also very many people who are traders of currency were also linked to the old regime. So that gap, so if somebody has access to official currency, now that was controlled by the central bank who had access to that, immediately could go and make a huge windfall just by selling that currency in the black market. Or they can use it to buy imports much more cheaply than the private sector. And that was also going on. So just those two reforms took care of or addressed very big sources of corruption in dollar terms. There are other things. So, for example, just budget, public financial management, increasing transparency in procurement, eventually increasing transparency in concessions and public-private partnerships. There's a very, very wide range of reforms that were started but still need to happen. Frankly, we just ran out of time because of the coup. Public financial management was would have been a huge part of this year's reform effort, but that got interrupted. So the final area that I think really is a key part of battling corruption is financial sector reform. The financial sector in Sudan had been really affected by the years of being isolated, but also the fact that the currency was suppressed, the official market rate. So nobody who, for example, was transferring remittances or doing trade was going through the banking sector because just you wouldn't get the right prices. And it had the governance of the banking sector had gradually been, I would say, weakened by some of the wrong people owning parts of banks. So I think reforming the banking sector in order to strengthen good governance, make sure that it's held in the right hands, that anti-money laundering and other counterterrorism financing provisions are put in order to strengthen it so that it actually can be a vehicle for getting Sudan's capital deployed in the right places and growing small business, for example, and trade and agriculture as opposed to friends of the owners of the banks. That also was a big reform area for this year that got interrupted because of the coup.
And to follow up on that point for our audience members listening, on October 25th of 2021, the Sudanese military led by General Abdurrahman did essentially initiate a military coup and were successful in their efforts to dispose of the Hamdok-led government. So there's been this debate, and I think it's happened since the coup, that, one of the drivers for the coup was essentially these efforts to address corruption, to try to redress these past injustices, and that the coup leaders felt threatened from these initiatives and these programs, and I would assume also the reforms that were happening in the finance sector. So I would like to hear from you, Magdi. Do you agree with this, essentially this theory that these anti-corruption initiatives, programs, sets of reforms that were to be implemented did contribute to the eventual coup in October of last year?
Well, it's a really hard question to get into the heads of those who initiated. Again, I was mentioning that there was a power sharing agreement between the Transitional Military Council and the pro-democracy forces led by the Forces of Freedom and Change. And what General Burhan did in October was basically break that agreement because, as he was saying, that the government had become dysfunctional with disagreements within the civilian camp, and that he wanted to correct this and then restart the transition. I'm not going to, try to pronounce judgment on that, but I think it's very clear to everybody that this was a military coup, a full military takeover and an abrogation of an agreement that was reached that was internationally sponsored in August of 2019. No, what I'm not going to pass judgment on is whether there was disagreements or anything else, but it was very clear that there were people very angry about the dismantling committee and also security sector reform and a few other very key things that were being held up. I think all of these things would have happened or would have been much more sustainable had the sort of the legislative body been in place. But because all the power was in this committee, it was many of these things that should have happened were stalemated. People were not interested in, for example, some of the key reforms or opposed those reforms. And it's also evident from what happened after the coup that a lot of the folks who were involved in the dismantling committee were arrested, held for a while, even without trial, then let go, and then rearrested. And so they've borne a lot of the brunt. And a lot of the public back and forth, a lot of the public sort of spats that were happening earlier before the coup also were on the sort of dismantling committee and its efforts, and the need to establish the appeals committee and that sort of judicial or legal due process, which I think we'd all agree with. It didn't need a coup. It could have been fixed without a coup. And it would have been fixed if those who were in power believed in that process and wanted it to go forward. So if there's a stalemate and there's no parliament to appeal to, no legislature to appeal to, then I think things became a crisis that didn't need to be a crisis. And Prime Minister Hamdok had issued an initiative, and one of the things that he wanted to make sure moved forward were things like security sector reform and the legal structures and the appeals committee and the strengthening of this dismantling committee effort. I think over time, as we look at it today, we've seen some of these things been reversed. And what I worry about is it's hard to go back and try somebody again for the same crime or to prosecute them again. And this time they're going through as they're reversing things, they're going through and getting a legal stamp of authority in some of their reversals. So then it becomes just more complex to then go back and actually deliver a proper justice and, to disincentivize corruption in the future.
Thank you, Magdi. I had one follow-up question to Stacey's initial question. So I totally understand that it's impossible to know what was going through the minds of the folks who staged the October 25th coup. But when Stacey and I were in Khartoum, I guess about 5 weeks or so ago at this point, there was a lot of folks were saying that if the dismantling committee hadn't been so aggressive, especially around the issue of gold, and there'd been more dialogue, that the coup perhaps would not have happened. And who knows the answer to that question. But one interesting tidbit that came out during our meetings was that there was a $500 million tranche that was just days away from going to the Sudanese government, but that was forfeited because of the coup. So there were all these different factors in play. And there's a debate within the anti-corruption community globally, when you have a situation like you had in Sudan, should there be mechanisms in place to sort of slow down and speed up the pushes for anti-corruption reform, keeping in mind that anti-corruption reform can hit very, very sensitive pieces and sort of blow up all the progress that's been made to date. So I ask you this question not about the situation in Sudan specifically, because you've made clear that, who knows what the coup leaders were thinking. But I ask it more generally as somebody who worked at the World Bank, who watches these things around the world unfold. Is there more the international anti-corruption community could do to build in mechanisms, perhaps behind closed doors, that would prevent triggering and sort of blowing up the democratic process that's been made to date in a country, whether it's Sudan or some other country?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so I've looked at this problem. I worked on Cambodia. I worked in the Middle East during the Arab Spring in the wake of Mubarak and Ben Ali's fall. And so I've been in various situations, and I think I'd maybe draw on some of those experiences as well as Sudan. And I think a couple of things, if one could try to draw on a few kind of key principles or ideas that I drew from that, is that one of the highest priorities has to be what is required to create a viable state, and what's required to make sure that the economy continues to move forward. Now, in Egypt and Ben Ali's case, in an Egypt case, and to some extent Sudan, the scope of anti-corruption efforts was very wide because it was hard to put a box around what over 30 years happened because of its link to the Bashir regime or the empowerment process, and what was any other source of sort of crime or corruption that might have been treated differently. In the Mubarak case, so much of the economy had been affected by the regime. And once you started putting a legal process in place to reverse or end those links or to reverse any gains that had happened, pretty much the entire economy would be suspect, or anybody who had gained or developed a business, had somehow survived during that time, could see themselves as potentially a target. And so, that by not having it contained, particularly in Egypt, it kind of froze the economy for a while. In the Ben Ali case, who was close to the Ben Ali family was more clear. So it was almost like there was a natural border around those efforts, and the rest of the economy could proceed. I think that was also the case for Suharto, a large share, maybe half of the economy, but those who were not linked to the regime, one could build up the private sector with, around the problem, so to speak, and the economy can continue to grow. And so that sort of border or containing in a clear way, I think, is one of the lessons I would draw. So how do you make a very clear delineation between who is targeted for review, legal review and processing through the rule of law, and who isn't, so that those who want to do business and grow the economy can continue to do that? The other lesson is the need to embed these processes in the rule of law. I don't think that the blame should be put on the anti-corruption committee members or how they worked or anything like that. They had a legal mandate, and that legal mandate was backed by that joint council, but it really should have been through Parliament. And it's really the establishment of the appeals committee and the other measures to sort of put a stronger foundation around that effort, as well as to clearly delineate where it can and can't go. Those are the kinds of things that were needed. And that is really, I think, the lesson I would draw. I think everybody agreed to that constitutional document in 2019. Even post 2019, even today, I think all of the measures around political reform and pro-democracy still single out the NCP, the National Congress Party of Bashir regime, to be outlawed. So there is a measure of consensus, even within the current regime and setup, around the NCP and what measures it used to control the economy. It just needed a better legal framing so it would be sustainable. Now, the question you asked as to whether we should have slowed down that effort in order to move forward with the rest of the reform program, I think these things were moving in parallel, and there was a huge cost to the coup. And yes, in fact, there was a large budget support operation that was linked to reform that would have been approved and dispersed in November, December, assuming the board supported it. And there were many other projects that actually got stopped because of this coup. So yes, the cost was very high, but how do you put a number on the incentives or disincentives for corruption? Because the wealth of Sudan, is even bigger than those numbers we're speaking about. So if a huge share of the gold sector continues to go unofficially, or any other, either the remaining oil or agriculture, livestock, or many of the other resources that support the economy, if those don't become formal and official parts of the state, at least that royalties on a formal flow of gold, then Sudan is not going to be viable. So you do need to do the reforms I was speaking about earlier: financial sector, public financial management, a single treasury account, continued streamlining of other administrative processes that were used to create opportunities for corruption, customs reform. Many other reforms are needed, but you also need to make sure that there's a strong disincentive, that you create the mechanisms to operate legally and formally, and then you create an incentive to operate legally and formally by prosecuting corruption. So I think you need to do both.
Thank you, Magdi. That was great. And I would like to thank Magdi for joining us on this really insightful conversation on the issue at hand in Sudan. This is, I know, for both Frank and myself, really meaningful and productive conversation to have.
Democracy That Delivers has been brought to you by the Center for International Private Enterprise. For more information, please visit sipe.org.